Hello and welcome everybody. Today we are here for a bit of a set review, so to speak. I have in front of me the entirety of the cards from Modern Horizons 2 that I think are good or have potential in general, things that I think will either see play in Modern or could see play in Modern. And in the main board I have cards that I think are almost guaranteed you're going to see them. Either they're going to be staples or people are going to be playing them and they're probably going to be pretty decent and worth playing to some extent. Some people will play them just because they're cool cards and they do cool things, and some of them might end up being actual staples, we'll see. And then I also have in the sideboard a list of cards that I wanted to address in particular. Some of them I think have potential as sideboard cards or potential in general, but aren't quite there. And we'll go over all of them. So let's start right at the bottom end here with the new Suspend spells. I'm going to start with Glimpse of Tomorrow. This is a red Suspend 3 card for red. It says, shuffle all permanents you own into your library, then reveal that many cards from the top of your library. Put all non-aura permanent cards revealed this way onto the battlefield. Then do the same for all aura cards, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And before I talk about this one, I'm actually just going to go ahead and read Resurgent Belief as well. So this is the white Suspend card. It is a Suspend 2 for 2 mana, and it says, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So why am I pairing these two cards together? Well, that answer is simple. These cards scream combo to me. For example, if you can somehow get a Glimpse of Tomorrow to resolve, shuffle all your permanents into your deck, and reveal a bunch of cards from the top and be like, oops, here's an Imracul, or, something along those lines, put something big and dumb into play, these different permanents, then I could see somebody doing that. Whether it's good or not, I have no clue. Keep in mind that when you shuffle your stuff in and reveal the cards, it's all pretty random. That said, it seems like a pretty fun and ridiculous thing to be doing, and something similar, I think, applies for Resurgent Belief. If somebody can figure out how to make this card a combo card, then I guarantee you it will be played. Will it be good? I can't tell you that for sure. That obviously just depends on a potential deck list, but these cards I consider to be kind of the same, in that I actually personally think that Glimpse of Tomorrow is a little more playable. I think that's easier for this to combo off. Of course, the way that this is going to work is you're going to see people cascading into this with various cascade spells that they could use, and also casting Electro Dominance perhaps to put these cards directly on the stack. Things like the 3-mana enchantment, As Foretold, Electro Dominance, Cascade. There are various ways to break these kinds of Suspend cards, and especially cards like these where you have a potential to fill your graveyard with a bunch of enchantments, return to the battlefield, and win on the spot with enchantments. I've heard that there's some combo around that. Or just putting a bunch of big goofy permanents into play thanks to Glimpse of Tomorrow, just randomly hitting them off the top. I could see that being something that opponents will do. So that's where I'm going to start. Next, I'm going to move to the next card up the chain. So this card here, Soul Snare, 1 white for an enchantment. Pay a white and sacrifice it. Exile target creature that's attacking you or a planeswalker you control. So I think this card is playable at the very least, and I think it might be quite good. We'll have to see. But the reason that I think this card is playable, other than the fact that it's only marginally more expensive than something like Condemn or Oust, which are already kind of secondary removal spells that various blue-white decks happen to be playing, is the fact that Soul Snare, being an enchantment that you sacrifice to its ability, is something you can recur with Lurrus of the Dream Den. So in a control list that just happens to be playing Lurrus, then you can splash Soul Snare in there and get a repeatable removal spell out of your Lurrus if you're not just playing Bauble every turn. So regardless, I think that Soul Snare has some potential to be played. I don't know how good it will be. It may not be worth including, but I guarantee you'll see a little bit of it, and maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't. And that leads me to the next card, which is Suspend, the blue instant that exiles a creature and puts it on Suspend for 2 turns. And after 2 turns, they get to remove the last counter and recast it without paying its mana cost. And if it does resolve that and it's a creature, it will gain haste. I think that this card is extremely unique. I don't think it's busted on the surface. I think that this is kind of similar to Delay in a certain way, except for the fact that blue does not usually get to interact with things that have already resolved. And that is one of the things about Suspend that makes it interesting to my eye, at the very least, is obviously blue has had sort of a weakness against these types of prowess decks or other fast decks because they get to resolve permanents underneath your counter magic, and then you have to play from behind answering the spells on the stack while also dealing with the stuff that's on the board, and Suspend allows you to take one of those threats, take it off the board for some amount of time, and maybe have to deal with it eventually later, but by that time, maybe you'll have drawn the counterspell for it, or maybe it doesn't matter 2 turns from now. Say if you exile a Bird of Paradise or something like that, and they cast it off Suspend, you might not even care, but the ramp could have been extremely valuable to your opponent, and you denied them of that. So things like that make me interested in Suspend, and in particular, its interaction with Teferi Time Raveler, the fact that they won't be able to cast their spell off of Suspend, both the mechanic and the card, once a Teferi is on the battlefield, that makes it quite potentially very strong. So I suspect to see a little bit of Suspend. Again, I can't tell you whether I think this is going to be a format staple or not. We'll just have to see when it gets played out. I think it has potential to be good. I doubt that it's going to be, like, just completely dominating the format. However, that brings me to the next card, which is a Ravigan Nimble Pilferer. This is a 1-mana, 2/1 legendary creature, monkey pirate. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, make a treasure token that you can sacrifice for a mana, of course. And then exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn, you may cast that card. Now, I'm not going to lie, when I just read it right now, I didn't realize that that second part of text was on the card about exiling a card and being able to cast it. I honestly thought this was just a 1-mana, 2/1 that made a token that lets you get a mana, and I already thought that was good enough. Now that I know that it also involves card advantage as well, this card is pretty insane. I mean, of course, it's going to die to removal spells. This is Modern, where people play creatures that die to removal spells, and that's just what happens. Ravigan is a force. If you're playing a deck that cannot answer a turn 1 Ravigan, I would be scared, because your opponent is ramping with their 1-drop, being proactive with their 2 damage. I would expect to see this in various aggressive decks. Any deck that's trying to cast Blood Moon, I would expect to see playing Ravigan, or Ragavan. I'm probably saying that wrong. Ragavan, so that they can cast that Blood Moon on turn 2 if Ragavan survives. And the dash, I think, is basically just blank text. I don't think that matters at all. Maybe it could in certain scenarios, but regardless, this is, in my opinion, just a very good 1-drop. I think it's going to be very good and played very frequently, so be ready for this one. Definitely a staple, in my opinion. The next card is Abundant Harvest. This is the 1-mana sorcery that lets you choose land or non-land, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal one of the chosen kind, and then put the rest on the bottom, and that card into your hand. So you say non-land, you reveal cards from the top of your deck until you get a non-land, you get to put that in your hand, and all the rest go on the bottom. Vice versa, if you name land, you get to reveal until you hit a land, the land goes in your hand, and the rest go on the bottom. I think that this card is extremely overrated, actually. I don't think that Abundant Harvest is that particularly powerful. I don't think it's got a very good amount of selection. It's best when all of your cards do the same thing if they're non-lands, and it's also very good if you have only 1 land or 2 lands and you absolutely need to hit a 3rd one. Those are situations where Abundant Harvest will shine, but most decks don't play a bunch of non-land cards that are just completely replaceable, and most decks don't rely that heavily on hitting every land drop or any specific land drop necessarily. So could I see Abundant Harvest being useful? Most certainly. I think it'll see play. I don't know how good it'll be. Maybe it'll be staple. Maybe people will stop playing it as if it was something like Sleight of Hand or Serum Visions that just gets replaced by other things that are better. For example, this is the color that's competing with Ancient Stirrings and Oath of Nissa. There are various other cards that have similar effects. Is Abundant Harvest the best of those effects? I do not know. That said, expect to see this one. This one is going to be a role player. Speaking of role players, we come to a card that, despite what I'm about to say about it, I actually really like. I have always loved Noble Hierarch, and here we have Ignoble Hierarch, the Jund version of Noble Hierarch. The 0/1 for 1 with Exalted, and it taps for Jund colors, so black, red, or green. And the reason why I say, despite what I'm about to say, is, to me, this card and Noble Hierarch are practically the same card. Any deck that would have played Noble Hierarch, but has use for black and red mana rather than the blue and white mana, well, they'll play Ignoble Hierarch. And the other decks that want access to the blue and white, for example, Bant, Stoneblade type decks, or maybe even Infect if they're not splashing black, will still play Noble Hierarch. To me, this is just basically another copy of Noble Hierarch. I don't know if there's a deck out there that wants to play 4 or both. Maybe. I don't know. I'd be surprised. I would love every second of it if that was the case, but regardless, this is just another one of those cards I'm like, yeah, it's going to be good. It's going to see play. I think that this one definitely falls into that staple territory. I could see Jund playing a couple copies of this just to play Liliana the Veil on turn 2. with more consistency. Ignoble Hierarchy never really did that, and Birds was always kind of bad. That said, I don't know that playing a 1-mana 0/1 creature in Jund is going to be great, so we'll see. But regardless, definitely a staple. I would look out for this one. And now we come to the next 1-drop, which is Aquarian Ranger. This is a 1-mana 1/1 that lets you return a forest to untap a creature, and this can be activated only once each turn. So immediately, my first thought with this is actually the Vannifar combo deck, where they were playing a 2-mana version. It was like some kind of scout or something, some elf creature that did exactly the same thing as Aquarian Ranger, except it costed 1 extra. And here we have it in elf form, if the previous one wasn't Aryan Elf. I should have looked it up before this, but I didn't. And in particular, Aquarian Ranger, I think it'll see play in Elves decks where you can untap, for example, an Elvish Archdruid or whatever with your Aquarian Ranger and use it again. I think that Ranger has a lot of potential. That's all I can say about it. It's just a good card. And if there's a deck that wants to use it, it's going to be an Elf deck or probably Vannifar. I think that it has fringe usage, but still worth making the list, I think. The next one is Brainstorm, the 1-mana artifact that you can pay 2 and sacrifice it to Brainstorm. Draw 3 cards, put 2 back from your hand on top of your library in any order. Literally, this is just a card that I think is going to be used to enable miracles. I personally think that it will be good enough. We've already seen things like Sensei's Divining Top in Legacy, where just being able to spin top to set up a miracle has been extremely important. And in Modern, Miracling Terminus is very, very strong. Mainly Miracling Terminus just seems like the best thing you can do with Brainstone, and there is a deck, Blue-Eye Control, in Modern, that would love to be able to consistently Miracle Terminus, and I think that Brainstone is most likely going to see play in those decks. Any other deck that plays Brainstone is probably some kind of artifact degeneracy, like just playing a bunch of artifacts for value, like an Imri Urza deck or something, and Brainstone might go in there. I don't know. We'll have to see as time goes on. It's very good with fetch lands, too. 3 mana for the effect, but probably still good enough. And the last 1-drop that I'm going to talk about, as I do consider a Prismatic Ending to be mainly a 1-drop, is this innocuous 1-mana uncommon sorcery, Prismatic Ending, Converge, exile target non-land permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. So for 1 mana and 0x, so basically just 1 white, you can exile any non-land permanent with a cost of 1 or less. So this is going to be a very clean answer to cards like Swift Spear, Goblin Guide, Noble Hierarchy, like Birds of Paradise, like Mana Dork kind of effects, Arbor Elf, Utopia Sprawl, all kinds of 1-mana spells, like things, even random weird hate pieces like Pithing Needle. Already as a 1-mana sorcery, this is impressive, and people are already starting to play things like On Thin Ice over Path to Exile in Modern, because giving your opponent a land is a huge drawback. And here we have a card that is capable of answering a turn 1 threat without ramping your opponent, and it's not going to be weak to your opponent just ghost courting away your land or whatever, or having something to kill an enchantment. That said, the same decks that want to play 1-mana removal for early threats are the decks that have trouble beating resolved planeswalkers. I'm talking about Wrenn and 6 and 3 Fairy. These are cards that are extremely problematic for control decks in particular. I think that Ending being a 2-mana sorcery that exiles target Wrenn and 6, or a 3-mana sorcery that exiles target Liliana the Veil, Teferi Time Raveler, that's the one I'm thinking of. Even if you end up in the late game paying an inordinate amount of mana to exile something crazy like a Jace the Mind Sculptor or something like that, some big non-creature permanent. It also hits things like Ensnaring Bridge as well, by the way, Blood Moon even. So I think that Prismatic Ending is quite strong, and I could see it being a very big role player in Control. I was actually hoping for a reprint of Council's Judgment, and in some ways this is going to be actually kind of similar to Council's Judgment. So I'm pretty excited about this card, and I think it's very good. In fact, I'm already in the market to pick up 4 copies, and the set literally just released on Magic Online, so I think it's going to be very good. Counterspell, we already know this one. Counterspell is just infinitely better than Mana Leak or Logic Knot, and that's about it. Counterspell is going to see play. It's going to be strong. Is it going to be much stronger than Mana Leak and Logic Knot? Personally, I don't really think so. It's just a 2-mana answer. I don't really think there's much more to it than that. Persist, the 2-mana sorcery that returns a non-legendary card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a counter on it. I think that this card is probably the best reanimation spell that has been printed since Goryo's Vengeance for Modern, and that in and of itself is going to make Persist an immediate staple. the fact that it can't hit legendary creatures like, I don't know, Grizzlebrand is already a huge detriment to the card, so it definitely decreases the power level. But that said, you can still do some fun things with the big 6-mana green creature. I forgot the name of it. Alright, I looked it up. It's Protean Hulk, the big creature that does all the combo shenanigans. That is a very good target for Persist. Is it going to be good? I don't know. But Persist is a good card regardless. It's easily the best reanimation spell since Goryo's Vengeance that was printed. And whatever creature you put into play, you don't have to sacrifice, which is not something that's ever really been done at this low of a mana cost in Modern. So this card, very good, and I expect it to make waves. Similarly, the card that was printed along with it, Unmarked Grave, searching for a non-legendary card, putting it into the graveyard, and then making you shuffle. This is going to go perfectly hand-in-hand with the previous card. Again, there's not really another card like this in Modern, and it will be a staple, guaranteed. Whether the decks that play it good enough are going to be good enough or not, I have no clue, but you should be aware of these cards. Next, we have Damn, the sorcery that destroys a creature and it can't be regenerated, but if you overload it for the mana cost of Wrath of God, then you get to destroy all creatures, and it can't be regenerated. So this is a spot removal spell that escalates into a Wrath of God. If that doesn't already sound powerful to you, then I don't know what to tell you. In control decks or mid-range decks in Modern, you can't really get caught dead playing things like Supreme Verdict and, Damnation and cards like that, because 4 mana is just too slow for some opponents who aren't really going to commit too heavily into your Supreme Verdict or whatever, and you really would rather just hit a single creature, and this is a card that does it all. For 2 mana, you can destroy a creature, and it can't be regenerated. For 4, you can destroy all creatures. It does both. I think Esper Control definitely has some use for this card. It's a little heavy on the mana cost, but I think that can be worked around, and I would expect to see this card at least a little bit. I don't think that there are very many decks that are popular that can take advantage of this effect in white and black, but we'll see. I think this is definitely one to keep on your radar. It's a very good sweeper, so even if it doesn't see a whole lot of play, this is definitely going to be one of the best cards to play in that slot in the decks that can use it, so that's why I included it here. Dalty Voidwalker, the 2-mana 3/2 that has been making waves. Shadow makes it practically unblockable because who's playing creatures with Shadow in Modern? It says, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead I exile it with a void counter on it, and then you can tap it and sacrifice it to choose an exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. So, yeah, it's a 2-mana, 3/2 unblockable creature pretty much, and it has a relevant line of text, and it can give you card advantage. This should be already sending off alarm bells in your head. It's a good threat, has a relevant ability, and has potential to gain card advantage in combination with the rest of your strategy. It's going to be good. Admittedly, I feel like this card would be just completely busted if, when it connected with an opponent, like did combat damage to him, it exiled the top card of their library with a void counter on it, so that you would have a guaranteed way to accrue some advantage with it. But as is, I think it's very good. So definitely expect to see this one. Flame Rift, the 2-mana sorcery that deals 4 damage to each player. I think that this card is mainly going to be there for burn strategies, and only the most committed, the ones that are willing to take 4 damage themselves in order to get their opponent dead. I think that does exist in Modern, and there's definitely a place for another 2-mana card that does 4 damage, so I would expect to see a little bit of Flame Rift. I don't think it's the strongest burn spell, but anyways, definitely worth a mention. It most likely will be seeing play to some extent. Solitary Confinement, an enchantment that unless you discard a card, you have to sacrifice it in your upkeep. It makes you skip your draw step, but it gives you Shroud and prevents all damage that would be dealt to you. This is only here for specifically the enchantment decks that exist in Modern. Of course, the card that I'm talking about is Enduring Ideal, the card that will search for this one of in their deck, put it into play, and all of a sudden you can't target them and can't deal damage to them. This will prevent damage from lightning bolt effects and from, combat damage, things like that. And I think that they will be able to make use of this just enough turns to be able to win the game off of whatever else is they're doing. So I think Solitary Confinement will see play there and basically nowhere else. Sanctum Prelate, the 3-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, choose a number. Non-creature spells with the mana value of the chosen number can't be cast. This one, I think, is pretty simple. It's just a relatively decent hate bear. Note that it does say non-creature spells, so this is going to be not as effective against opponents playing creatures that they can't really stop you from playing, but it's still relatively decent. I know for a fact it will be tested in Hate Bears and Death and Taxes style decks. Whether it'll stick or not, I'm not 100% sure, but you could definitely expect to see this one seeing play. Fractured Sanity, the 3-mana sorcery that mills 14 cards, and when they cycle it, it mills 4 cards instead. Obviously, I think that mill will play this card. They don't have a whole lot of cards that mill a very large amount of cards all at once. The best card that they play probably is Glimpse the Unthinkable, which mills 13? Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe it's 13. And for 1 mana more, this is basically a slightly better Glimpse the Unthinkable. It's an effect they're looking for, and if they absolutely can't afford to pay 3 mana for this effect, or if they're looking for other cards, they can just cycle it and still get some value, so definitely a good card. Imperial Recruiter, the 1-mana 1/1 that lets you search for a creature with power 2 or less, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Obviously, this is insane with Ephemerate, among other cards that are on this list, and it is pretty adept at either finding the exact hate creature that you need, or setting up some number of combos, be it Kikijiki or whatever. I definitely expect Imperial Recruiter to see play in those decks, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. Vindicate, of course, one that probably should have been in Modern for a very long time already. 3 mana, destroy target permanent. It's pretty good against Tron lands in the decks that want to play Vindicate. It definitely will help the Tron matchup. It's basically a Maelstrom Pulse in Abzan. It doesn't hit multiple copies of cards, but Pulse never really needed to anyways. Vindicate's good. It's not going to be a 4-of staple, I don't think, but we'll see it. Grist, the Hunger Tide, the 3-mana Planeswalker that counts as an insect when it isn't on the battlefield, and it pluses to make an insect and mill card, and if it was an insect that was milled, which probably will never happen, then you get to put a additional loyalty counter on Grist and repeat the process. It pluses to make a creature, it minuses to let you sack a creature and destroy a threat from your opponent, be it a creature or a Planeswalker, and -5, each opponent loses life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Honestly, that probably will never come across, but if it does, it'll probably win the game. I just think that this is a powerful effect for you to be able to search for from your deck and put it into play with cards like Eldritch Evolution, Court of Calling, that kind of thing. I definitely think there's a place for it, so that's why I've included it here. Maybe it won't see too much play outside of that particular deck that takes advantage, though. Shardless Agent, I mean, let's be honest, 3-mana 2/2 artifact creature with Cascade. We already play cards like Bloodbraid Elf because of the fact that it has Cascade. People have been clamoring for Shardless Agent to be reprinted, and here it is. Of course people are going to play it. It's going to be particularly good in the decks that were cascading into Living End with cards like Violent Outburst and Ardent Plea, cards that were slightly off color. That was a 4-color deck. Now it can drop down to 3 colors with Shardless Agent. Violent Outburst plus Agent will probably make that deck a rug deck or a teamer deck. Anyways, definitely going to see play. And then we do see a couple of these cards from the pitch cycle, Subtlety and Grief. I'm going to talk about Grief first because this card is an absolute staple. It will see play. The decks that play it will play 4, and I guarantee it. It's very good with Ephemerate. If you build your deck correctly, it's very good in general. All you need to do is try to support some of the card advantage you're losing by drawing some extra cards or gaining some sort of value. Of course, for those of you who are not familiar, it's the 4-mana 3/2 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, you get to take a card from their hand and make them discard it. And, well, a non-land card, of course. And you can evoke it out just by exiling a black card and get it in for free, ephemerate it, get a second trigger. Very powerful stuff. And unfortunately, Subtlety, the blue variety of this effect, is not quite as strong. It's a 4-mana flash flyer. It's a 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, it basically Aether Gusts a creature or planeswalker spell. Not reliant on color, of course. This is any creature or planeswalker spell. Puts it on the top or bottom, and you can evoke it out by exiling a blue card. I think this card is just worse than Force of Negation, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a place. It's also a flash 3/3 flyer that doubles as interaction and a pinch, and I think that is highly underrated, as control players are always looking for ways to end the game without having to actually commit cards to their deck to ending the game, because it makes it easier and faster to play control. And this is a flash 3/3 flyer that has the relevant ETB ability, and if you can't cast it for 4 mana, you can pitch a card to cast it from your hand anyways, and just use it as interaction and not as a way to end the game. Either way, I think that this card is good. It's not going to be a 4 of anywhere. It might not even be played, but it's good enough to potentially see play, and people will definitely be messing around with it. Next, we have Obsidian Charma, a 5-mana 4/4 that costs 1 less for each land that your opponents control that could produce a colorless mana. It's a 4/4 flyer, by the way, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. Obviously, this card has a 100% guaranteed home, Panza. Those red land destruction decks will want to play Charma, even if it was just a 5-mana 4/4 flyer that popped a lane when it came into play. That might be strong enough. The fact that it is particularly good against decks that are playing colorless lands is good. I think we'll see a decent bit of this card. Murktide Regent, the big delve spell that ultimately is basically just a 2-mana 3/3 flyer at worst, and if you exile instants and sorceries with it, then it gets bigger, and whenever an instant or sorcery card leaves your graveyard while it's in play, it gets another counter on it, so it works well with Snapcaster Mage after the fact. Let's just be honest, it's not very hard to get this card into play for 2 mana. Turn 1, fetch Thought Scour. Turn 2, fetch, play this. You've already got your thing in play as a 4/4 flyer for 2 mana. That's very strong, and it only gets better as the game goes on. It's a little weak to graveyard hate, but other than that, this card's very strong. I expect decks to be playing this very heavily, especially blue tempo decks. And finally, the last card in this main board list here of the cards I think are definite hits, Cauldron Complete, the 7-mana living weapon, indestructible equipment that says, equipped creature gets +5/+5, first strike, trample, indestructible, haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a creature, exile that creature. Let's just be honest. Stoneforge Mystic getting Batterskull is not that great in Modern. There are decks that easily beat a resolved Batterskull, and Cauldron Complete is not at all like that. A 5/5 rather than a 4/4, first strike winning in combat against most creatures, trample making sure that you're clocking your opponent, indestructible making the creature unassailable unless it's getting exiled by some effect, and haste meaning that you can activate Stoneforge on your turn 3, put Complete into play, and immediately attack with at least 5 power worth of damage. That's great. The equip 7 cost is pretty ridiculous, and I think it probably had to be that high for this card not to just immediately get switched over to another creature. But let's be honest, the creature that you equip this thing with is not going to die. It's indestructible. You have to exile it. It's only weak to Path to Exile, and I guess maybe something like Prismatic Ending or whatever exile type effects. That said, it's a very strong card. I expect this to be played with Stoneforge Mystic a lot, as a one of course. So that ends the cards that I think are definite staples. I have a few cards here that I wanted to talk about. Some of them I've included for reasons other than that I think they're good, and I'll just go ahead and break the ice with Dragon's Rage Channeler, a 1-mana 1/1. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Surveil 1, and then Delirium. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it gets +2/+2, flying, and attacks each combat if able. I'm just going to say it. This card is a trap. This is a horrible 1-mana card. You play it on 1. I guess you get to surveil a little bit, but let's just be honest. This is just a 1-mana 1/1. Every Lava Dart on the planet is going to laugh when Dragon's Rage Channeler comes into play. And the Delirium is also a trap. Delirium is not easy to establish, and a 3/3 flyer for all this amount of effort that you put into it while your opponent's just been playing good cards. This card is, I don't like it. I don't think it'll see play. I mean, it'll see play, but I don't think it'll stick. It won't be good. Sanctifier Invec, 2-mana Human Cleric. It's a 2/2, pro black and red. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards that are black or red from all graveyards. If a black or red permanent spell or card not on the battlefield would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. This is a card that I think is going to be specifically good as a sideboard answer to things like Dredge. It can do some good stuff against mono red or mono black decks. It blocks Death Shadow all day long and hates on Gormag Angler like nobody's business. And in general, I just think it's a relatively good card. It doesn't It's not quite as good as Core Firewalker against the red decks, but something like Rest in Peace on a 2-mana creature is not something that I'm aware has ever been in Modern before, and I think for that reason alone, this is something to notice. It might not be good enough to play. It'll probably be a sideboard card at best, but I think it's good. Speaking of sideboard card at best, we have Break the Ice, a 2-mana black sorcery, destroy target land that is snow or can produce colorless. This card is extremely, extremely narrow. Narrow is the word that I would use to describe this card. It only hits snow permanents or things that tap for colorless. It'll be good maybe as a sideboard card against Eldrazi and regular Tron. And yeah, that's about it. If you want a sideboard card that is good against specifically those decks and nothing else, and is a 2-mana sorcery that doesn't actually further your own game plan, then sure, play this card if you want. It's a little sad that it makes it a little worse to play Snowlands, but it's whatever. I mean, I think it's a little sad because I'm not trying to abuse Snowlands, and I don't think most people are. But regardless, it doesn't mean that there's some cost to playing Snowlands. So I think this card is not that great. It's probably going to be played in the sideboard, if at all, and I don't think it's even very good for that. I don't know. Next card, Sanctum Weaver, and I'm actually going to lump this one with the Sithis Harvest Hand as well. These are two Enchantress-style cards. One of them is a 2-mana 0/2 creature that taps for a number of mana of one color equal to the number of enchantments you control. And the other one is a 2-mana 1/2 that says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 1 life and draw a card. And actually, I'm going to also lump in Enchantress's Presence into that as well. It's a 3-mana enchantment that says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. Again, all of these three have in common, enchantment matters as a sub-theme. People like to play enchantment decks. These cards are good for an enchantment deck in Modern if people were going to play it. Whether that deck will be good or not, again, I can't tell you for sure, but these cards will most likely see play in that deck if it exists, and that's why I have them here. Endurance, the 3-mana evoke creature from the previous cycle we were talking about. 3 mana for a 3/4 flash or reach is already pretty good stats, and when it enters the battlefield, up to one target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom in a random order. And of course you can evoke this out if you want to, and it also has a somewhat relevant, ability when it comes into play, helping yourself beat mill or something like that. I know some Amulet players have talked about playing Endurance, and I could kind of see it. I think it's a little narrow as a 3/4 reach, is actually pretty nice. Being able to flash it in and block your opponent's Sprite Dragon, for example, that just attacked, and they think it's going to connect for 1 point of damage, and you're like, ha 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 ha, eat your Sprite Dragon for breakfast. I could definitely see that being good. I think that it could be a good card. It might not be a good card. It just depends on how it pans out, but we'll see. Foundation Breaker, the 4-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment and evoke for 1 and a green. This is basically just an upgrade to Reclamation Sage and the decks that wanted to be able to Summoner's Pact for Reclamation Sage. So I'm talking about, of course, Amulet Titan, the deck that I specialize in, and maybe some other decks that play Summoner's Pact, like Scapeshift, for example. Foundation Breaker is just strictly better, in my opinion, than Reclamation Sage in those matchups. The 2/1 body almost never matters, and the extra mana to cast / evoke versus Foundation Breaker is extremely relevant. So I think that Foundation Breaker is going to be the new go-to over Rec Sage in the sideboard for those decks. Nevins Disc, or Nevins Disc, I don't know how to pronounce that. If you do, then let me know. The 4-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, and for 1, you can sacrifice it to just... Oh, well, actually, I guess you don't actually sacrifice it. You pay 1 and tap it and destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So I guess it kind of destroys itself. I think this is a good card. To be honest, I mainly include this just because I like the card, and I'm glad to see it in Modern. I don't think it'll see much play. I don't think it's that great. Is it better than Oblivion Stone? Debatable. We'll see, but Disc is good. It's a nice inclusion. Solitude, the white evoke creature. This is the one that Swords to Plowshare as a creature when it comes into play. It's a flash lifelink 3/2 body for a 5 mana cost, and you can evoke it out by exiling a white card. Again, this is going to be similar along the lines of Endurance. The enter the battlefield ability is relevant, but it's pretty niche, it's pretty specific, and paying a card, 2 cards really, to get 1 Swords to Plowshare's effect is not that great. In this particular case, I think it'll be quite good with Ephemerate, and other than that, I don't know that Solitude is that fantastic. It's not quite like Subtlety, as a 5-mana flash lifelinker for 5 mana is not that great, whereas a flash 3/3 flyer for 4 is fine, and it closes out the game just well enough. Solitude, I don't know, we'll see. Maybe it makes some waves, maybe it doesn't. That's why I've put it in the board here. Upheaval, the 4-mana sorcery that bounces all permanents. I mean, it's just a powerful effect. If somebody can't abuse this, I'll be surprised. Yeah, that's all I can say about it. I think Upheaval is interesting. I don't know how somebody would abuse it, but I'm sure it can be done. And then finally, Thrasta, Tempests Roar, the 12-mana 7/7 trample haste creature that costs 3 less for each other spell cast this turn, and tramples over planeswalkers, and has hexproof as long as they enter the battlefield this turn. For a huge, gigantic Timmy card with tons and tons of text, you just know that this card is going to see play. I bet that it won't be very good, but of course it's going to see play. People are going to jam this in their Bushwhacker decks, where they're trying to just use Manamorphos and Bushwhackers and BTEs to power out, a bunch of power. And Thrasta is one of the things that you can play that is part of that strategy. I think it'll see play there. Is it going to be good? Who can say? I doubt that it'll be very good, but at the very least, people will play it, and that's why I've included it here. So anyways, that was my detailed rundown of all of the cards that I thought were noteworthy from Modern Horizons 2, and the cards that I think that you should look out for, or at least be familiar with from the set. And yeah, let me know if you think I missed any. If I didn't include a card here, presumably it's because I didn't think it was good enough, but maybe I just missed it. If there's a card that you think has potential and you would like to hear my thoughts on, then drop it in the comments below. But yeah, I have nothing else to say. Thank you guys for joining me for this review, and I apologize if it was longer than you wanted, but regardless, I did say it would be in-depth. So, this is Redface Menace, signing off.